Good afternoon, dear guests, colleagues, friends. Here we are in 2024 and the world keeps on spinning. That is generally good news. Apart from that, a lot is in flux and indeed at stake, including the cohesion, security, competitiveness, and global role of Europe. But it is definitely excellent news that you have joined us today for our 5th edition of the MERICS China Forecast event that we are again proudly organizing together with our media partner, Handelsblatt. This regular event is also part of the work of a consortium of fantastic research partners that we're doing in the framework of a Horizon Europe funded project appropriately named China Horizons. 2024 will be a decisive year for China again and its relationship with the rest of the world and Europe. It is critical for us to anticipate the direction and magnitude of change, discuss the factors shaping developments, and prepare ahead to maximize opportunities and develop resilient responses in a highly volatile environment. We have assembled a fantastic lineup of excellent speakers today to help us engaging in that conversation. Speakers will share their expectations for the months ahead, including on China's domestic political and economic trajectory, as well as global implications, including for European governments and companies. The keynote will be held by Ambassador Jorge Toledo, the current EU ambassador to China since 2022. Thank you, Jorge. It's an honor to have you and great to see you again. He must have been very busy with high-level exchanges between the EU and China that have taken place in the past month, and we really look forward to hearing from him. His input will be followed by 2 great panels discussing China's internal and external trajectory, moderated by my colleagues Bernhard Bartsch and Nicole Bastian at Handelsblatt. And we will also share with you a snapshot of the results of our annual survey on China and Europe-China relations. Your input will be as important as ours today in at least 3 ways. And to get us all into the forecast and thinking mode, while possibly at home you have lunch, we have prepared a few questions for you in an online survey. So please be ready to use your mobile phones or another browser tab to access menti.com. The details you see already on the screen. Please also feel free to use the chat to discuss and ask questions. Our moderators during the panels will be trying to follow your engagement and bundle or channel questions to our panelists where possible in this setup. And finally, we are always happy to receive your feedback. Do reach out to us after the event and be in touch. Now, if you can already access menti.com, what should happen now on the screen is that the first question should be fielded to you. The code to access is still available and visible on top, and it's always a bit of a challenge to get the first responses in, but I already see results flying in. We are just a few days after the Taiwan elections, and obviously one of the big questions that we all be facing will be to what extent these elections will influence cross-strait relations and stability. And we look forward to hearing your assessment as well as the one by other colleagues later during the sessions. A second question that will follow in a minute is how prominently you expect China to feature in European election campaigns. It's an important year for Europe. And obviously, Europe is busy with core issues that are at the heart of the European project. China increasingly counts in that list, and we wonder to what extent you think China will feature in European elections this year. And moving on to the third question, again, just to get you into thinking mode, is we have another big election, obviously, in the list of, I think, more than 60 elections this year globally. How prominently do you expect China to feature in the US presidential elections this year? One of the big questions associated, obviously, is what the direction of changes that we shall expect depending on the outcome of these elections, which we will certainly cover in upcoming forecast events. Finally, two sets of questions that lead us more to the domestic politics of China. We are looking at a year of economic and social pressure. And the question that we ask ourselves is, how will the leadership manage socioeconomic stress in 2024? And we anticipate, obviously, measures to take place. The direction of these measures, again, is contested and up for debate. And finally, looking forward to your final response here, how do you expect Xi Jinping and his political agenda to fare in 2024? We find it always important not just to look at external success criteria, but also to measure what defines success for the central leadership in Beijing. And I think that's a question that we should ask ourselves: to what extent does the leadership perceive itself to be successful in 2024? Thank you all for this warm-up exercise. I think this is enough to get us started. Now, without any further ado, I really look forward to the input and keynote speech by Ambassador Jorge Toledo. Again, a warm welcome to this setup here, live from Beijing. China in 2024 and the relevance for Europe. Thank you for being us. We look forward to your input. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning in Europe. Good evening here. It's 7 o'clock p.m. I'm very happy to join your annual China Forecast survey. I was not, I didn't have the chance to attend last year for some reason, I don't know. But I know it is a very important event that is being watched by many, many people. So I will try to sum up in 10 minutes what I think could happen. Although I hate forecasts, especially if they are for the future, because you know, and I have read your forecast 2024 just before I joined you in this VTC. And well, I can hardly disagree with the trends that are pointed out there. The problem with forecasts is that you usually take what has been happening recently and project it into the future. And if we took, as I said, I didn't attend your event last year, but I'm sure that most of the things that you forecasted, or that the survey forecasted, were not confirmed in the course of 2023. There are, I'm sure, differences between what was forecasted for 2023 and what happened. Things that we thought were going to happen in 2023 and didn't happen, or things that we thought were going to happen in 2023 in a certain way and happened in another way. For instance, in January 2023, we had just got out of the extremely stringent COVID restrictions in China. And we all thought that there was going to be quite gradual, but also rapid increase in traveling in high-level contexts. Yes, they were. So that was right. There has been an incredible amount of international meetings that had not been held in person in 4 years. Lots of visits, but no resumption in inbound tourism. I'm sure that people were thinking that there was an appetite to go back to China for tourism. Well, 1 year after that, I've been I stayed in Christmas here in New Year's, and I went around to Guangzhou, to Shanghai, to Hangzhou. You can barely see a foreign tourist. It's absolutely incredible. I remember when we, ambassadors of the European Union, went to Chongqing and took the river cruise of the Yangtze, which is a very extraordinary, attractive tourist attraction. And I was told by the organizers that back in 2019, 95% of the clients were American. There was not a single American. In fact, the only foreigners on the boat were us, the EU ambassadors. We thought that expats who had left would gradually come back. That's not happening at all. We calculate that about 30% of EU expat left during the pandemic restrictions, and very few of them are coming back. After 4 years of increased controls via social network, via cameras, increased controls that prevented people from moving around, we thought that the opening up and the lifting of the controls of the pandemic will allow for less control and more. Sorry, but I got this. I have to. 1 second. No, we thought that people would feel freer. Well, it has not happened. The increased obsession about national security can be seen in millions of cameras everywhere with facial recognition. The need, and this is quite recent, for state and party cadres, officials, to get clearance for meeting foreign diplomats. That didn't happen. That was not happening a few years ago. Even control in universities. You cannot enter freely universities in China anymore. Students and professors in universities, the Chinese members of think tanks, need authorization to meet us diplomats. This we didn't expect, but it's there and it's gradually increasing. We all thought that after 4 years of depressed economic activity, especially in 2022, that economic analysts thought 2023 would be a year of strong rebound. Well, it hasn't happened. Why not? Well, COVID, 3 years of restrictions, 3 years of testing the whole population almost every day, if not every day, have depleted local finances, which are in charge of education and health, and the real estate crisis has also helped to deplete local finances, because the provinces were getting about 30% of the revenues from the sale of land. Add to that low external demand, collapse in foreign investment, stock exchange going down almost 30% in 1 year compared to rises in Japan, in the US, in Europe, geopolitics, of course, national security and government measures. It didn't help that during the pandemic, there was a crackdown on real estate, there was a crackdown on digital platforms. And at the same time, to kind of compensate for less revenues or less growth from real estate, there has been an increase in the investment in manufacturing, which has led, coupled with a low demand, to overcapacities. Well, the upside of this is that China has finally become a leader, and it has the best supply chains when it comes to EV cars, to renewables, etc. The downside is that this has led to overcapacity and a collapse in prices. And the threat of this that can be projected into the future is that the risk is that China will start flooding the market at incredible prices, and this will put our industries at risk. So, and finally, Premier Li Qiang announced yesterday in Davos that the Chinese economy had grown 5.2%. Some analysts don't believe it. Other analysts don't know, or most of analysts don't know, how can an economy which has which relied on real estate by 25% of the GDP and has not only not grown the real estate sector, but it has gone down by almost 10% at least, with consumption not going up as expected, and other trends that have been we have been witnessing last year grow at 5.2%. But big question, we'll see what happens. In any case, what are the trends? The trends are similar to last year, and a China that is more repressive at home and more assertive or more even aggressive outside. That's the general trend. National security continues to trump the economy, and we don't expect that to change either. More and more measures prove that this is the trend that Xi Jinping and the government are going to follow. We see the counter-espionage law, the cross-border data transfer law, the raid on consultancies, and all the measures I told you before about universities, think tanks, etc. We see less transparency. One very blatant example is the decision not to publish statistics of youth unemployment. That is, decision not to publish statistics when they are not positive. A very recent one, the decision not to publish, as it was the case until now, all court rulings. Now only selected court rulings will be published in their entirety. Everything, this is affecting the economy. This is affecting foreign direct investment, of course. And in foreign policy, we have a big uncertainty, which is the American election, because, well, the Taiwan election is no longer an uncertainty. It's been surprisingly well taken by the Chinese government. So far, so good. Now we enter a period until the inauguration of the new Taiwanese government, if I may say so, Taiwanese government, where we'll see what happens. Everybody was expecting some kind of military activity or resumption of military activity. We are not seeing that so far at a big scale, at least. The European elections, I suppose China will have some influence, but not much. I suppose they will have more influence in 5 years' time, when the results of the overcapacity, if our markets and our industrial sector is flooded by Chinese products, that could have more impact in the next European election, not in these ones. I don't think the Chinese are very preoccupied about our elections either, but they are very much as we are in Europe, preoccupied by the result of the American elections. I'm sorry. In fact, some of the measures, some of the policy actions that the Chinese were going to take or are going to take are going to wait until the American elections. One example, for instance, is that they seem to have finally decided to upgrade their ambitions on the climate change, fight against climate change objectives, but they will wait until 2025. Clearly, because they want to wait and see who is in government in the US. Because if it is Donald Trump and he withdraws again from the climate change agreements, then why upgrade their commitments? These are the trends. We'll see what happens. There are plenty of gray rhinos, black swans, and all kinds of animals that we call reality that could change what we think could be a 2024 when it comes to China. I stop here and I will take questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think your point on the usefulness of forecasts is well taken, and the risks of extrapolating from previous trends. Thanks also for sharing your assessment of current developments. I think that's of critical importance. I think we'll have to move on with the next panels. So it was great to hear from you live from Beijing, indeed, and we wish you the best of luck in navigating 2024 in EU-China relations in this decisive year. With that, I would like to hand over to my colleagues and the panel in waiting. Bernhard Bartsch will moderate the first session on domestic politics and trends in China. Over to you, Bernhard, and thank you again, Ambassador Toledo, for making the time. It's much appreciated. Have a good day.
Thank you, Miko. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You have indeed pointed out the difficulty in making forecasts. So we are here in the business of publicly being wrong about the future and the next year. At the same time, we do make decisions based on expectations, and we feel that it's important to be transparent about the expectations that we have. And the beauty of this event, obviously, is that we can both source expert wisdom and crowd wisdom. And in this first panel now, we will look at China's domestic trajectories. And I have three excellent colleagues, experts here, who will share with us their expectations as to where China is moving domestically. We are coming out of a year that has been difficult for China. We have economic, we have been seeing social pressure. The ambassador has laid out quite a number of the challenges ahead. And the question is, will we see stress relief? Will Xi Jinping's leadership be able to manage this stress well or less well this year? With me here on this panel are Lingling Wei. Welcome. Lingling is the China correspondent of the Wall Street Journal, based in China, but getting up very early for us today, joining us from Washington. Good morning. Staying up very late for us in Australia is John Garneau, founder of Garneau Global, also a former China correspondent and government advisor. And with us here in Berlin is my colleague Katja Drinhausen, who is the head of our research team on Chinese politics and society. Lingling, let me start with you and ask you what your expectations are for this year, especially with view of the pressure that the leadership is under, and whether you expect the leadership to manage the stress well or not so well.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here. Yes, China, as you all pointed out, had quite a difficult year in terms of, the economic performance. coming into 2024, the ambassador, just laid out a series of challenges facing the leadership, from economic, geopolitical to, social challenges. We do expect all those challenges to continue. I wanted to point it out that, one thing that Xi Jinping has been quite successful at is to continue his hold on power. That hasn't, been weakened in any way in terms of his political position. But what is debatable, and one may argue that one area that he has shown limits and weakness is, how his ability to carry on with all those agendas he put forward. We have seen the economy struggling, really largely of China's own making, the policymakers' own making. China used to have a very vibrant private sector, and that is not doing very well. We have seen the latest data showing private investment continuing to trend down. And China, used to be full of this kind of a can-do spirit. But if you ask business owners, individuals in China these days, they're the key word now is down. It's down. The sentiment is very down. So a lot of it's due to China's own policies. So we have seen Xi Jinping over the past couple of years having to dial back some of his initiatives on the margin, like common prosperity, this crackdown on real estate. Yes, they're continuing with certain policies, but over the past year, we have seen the government having to, start to relent to developers again. Just in terms of, yes, he has very firm control in terms of political position, but his ability to carry out his policy agendas, we're seeing that it's really being tested. And it's very important what China does this year. A lot of investors, analysts, and economists are watching for any signs of meaningful course correction in terms of China's econ policy. We're just not seeing that, because right now China's economic problems, yes, they have some specific economic challenges, like, for example, how to manage real estate crisis, how to manage local government debts. But fundamentally, those economic problems are rooted in politics. A lot of people in China, are feeling this kind of frustration and loss of hope, not because they adjusted not only because they suddenly adjusted some econ policy, but because they're feeling that the reform and the opening this past Deng Xiaoping put China on over the past 4 decades is now being reversed. So we're really have to look for more meaningful actions from the leadership. Talk is cheap these days. What the premier just said at Davos, yes, he really tried to present this China open for business message, but we need to see more actions coming out of Beijing. This priority the government put on security, is this going to continue? Our government's, local government's KPIs, have, continue going to be on economic performance, or their KPIs more tied to risk control these days? So we're going to, really continue to see any signs of changing in that regard. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Zhonggano, let me turn to you. Ling is making a very important point here that, of course, China has a lot of challenges, but things seem to be quite going for Xi Jinping personally, and this was also reflected in the survey that we just did at the beginning. There were quite mixed opinions on whether China is going to be successful in achieving stress relief, but there was quite a majority saying that Xi Jinping himself is nevertheless going to be very successful this year. What are your views on that? What are the trajectories that you see for the country's challenges and the party's and Xi Jinping's personal challenges?
Well, thank you, Bernard. Look, I like your framing for this session, and that is Xi Jinping's commitment to struggle, and that is one of his favourite verbs, if you like, and what it means for socioeconomic stress. So I think from the outset, we haven't seen much evidence that socioeconomic stress is one of Xi Jinping's primary objectives, alleviating socioeconomic stress. What we have seen is he's interested in regime preservation, party power, his own hold on power, marshalling the nation's resources in an international sense to project Chinese power. So that they're the KPIs that he is setting himself, and on that measure, he's probably doing okay. Moving down to what undergirds it all, and that is economic performance. It is really, we're watching a natural experiment in progress. We saw that Xi Jinping has a much higher economic pain threshold than many of us had expected. He's prepared to struggle. He has, some kind of affinity or fondness for the idea of austerity, of protracted warfare, of denying kind of instant gratification for future gain. All of those things are part of his character and part of his national story. But his tolerance for economic pain is not absolute. And so, over the last few months of last year, we saw some adjustments, some calibrations of economic policy settings, and they became a little bit clearer in the Central Economic Work Conference just before Christmas, where importantly he introduced this 4-character phrase, first establish and then break. First establish the new model of the economy before breaking the old. And we've seen a lot of exegesis in the state media about what that means. But essentially, he's in progress now of making more policy space, should he choose to use it, to inject more stimulus into the economy, to pump up the tires a little bit, to set a baseline, to set a floor under economic settings. So what he's not doing is any of the pro-market, pro-private sector regulatory rollback that many people are calling for. I think that's really clear, and I completely agree with Ling Wei that there's no sign of any sort of deregulation agenda. I think just last week with the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, the new plenary session, that Xi Jinping himself was talking about no reversal, no mercy in the CCDI, the Discipline Inspection, Anti-Corruption and Political Loyalty campaign. So the regulators, the most formidable and feared regulators, are maintaining their velocity and intensity that they have for the last few years. These have been relentless, disruptive and sometimes paralysing regulatory campaigns. We don't really see any sign that that's going to abate, but Xi Jinping has created a little bit more space for himself to adjust macroeconomic policy settings, and that might translate through to greater fiscal stimulus at some point. And certainly he's rolling back real estate restrictions, investment restrictions. But the problem, as Ling Wei has observed, is the private sector doesn't appear to be buying it. It's very difficult to convince investors and even cadres, talking about cadre KPIs, that it's in their interest, that they should believe that Xi Jinping's more positive signalling is credible, that their KPIs, their chance for survival, are still, they think, aligned with Xi Jinping's regulatory political control campaign. So on the economic, parameters, there are limits, there are constraints, there is a floor being set under the economy. I think that at least in the heavy industry parts of the and manufacturing parts of the economy, that there might be surprise to the upside. That has implications for commodities demand globally. That has implications, a lot of them negative, but for this export flood that is being pumped into the world. I think we're just seeing the early stages of that for some of the reasons that Ambassador Toledo outlined earlier. We're going to see much more of that. And then the real contest, the global contest is really we're setting the stage for that to play out over the course of this year. And I think one of the features, reluctant as Europe may be, Europe's at the centre of these tectonic plates. Europe is in some ways the swing state, the geopolitical battleground. At what point will Europe, the EU Commission, in its various anti-subsidies probes, counter-coercion probes, say enough is enough, that to push back against China's industrial program, this manufacturing export flood that's coming. I think that's going to be one of the most important stories of 2024.
Thank you very much. Katja, let's move over to you and the trajectory that you see. And there's already the first question from the chat that I'm going to throw at you, because I know that is something that you and your team here at MERICS are working a lot on. China's obsession with security. That's definitely going to be a trend that continues. So interested on your views on that specifically. And at this point, also encouraging audience members to please do post your questions, and we'll select them and pass them on to the panel later. Katja.
Thank you, Bernhard, also for already throwing that question at me. I want to start with actually picking up on the point that John just made on Xi Jinping's with the leadership threshold for economic pain, because I do think that one thing that we see with the current economic and social situation is that we're not just dealing with the aftermath of zero COVID. A year later, it's become really clear that the strict zero COVID policy had a damaging impact, but it was also an accelerator of really long-term structural, socio-economic and political issues. And Ling already mentioned kind of the political rigidity and stagnation that is causing some of these problems. But I think it's good to look at the laundry list of socio-political challenges that the government has in front of them, from government finances to the local fiscal situation, especially in a situation where local governments have to take on stronger and higher burdens of care for their citizens. The bad or stagnating income and wage situation, with wages actually decreasing relative to spending standards. We don't only have an issue of unemployment, but also of underemployment and really unstable, flexible jobs with longer term impacts for China's pension system and social security system. And we all know that protests over withheld wages are something that have been happening at the beginning of this year and throughout last year, and will likely continue, as especially companies are dealing with economic stress, not always able to pay up. And a key sector to watch here is the real estate sector, which doesn't only have structural and financial meaning, but has really important meaning on an individual level, as so many of China's citizens have invested their money, their life savings into property to ensure their long-term future. And I do think this is something that really impacts citizens' outlook on the future prospects of their country, but also for themselves. And I guess this is also where we stand at the moment. The government has initiated a series of high-level meetings and policy initiatives, some of which John already mentioned, with which it is trying to shake off the 2023 economic blues. But, you know, from last year's central financial and economic work conferences to its support measures and all the signals to appease and appeal to foreign investors, there is movement to address socioeconomic stress, but it's really clear that the big focus is on innovation, is on boosting consumption again, or at least hoping for that. There's a bit, you know, in the outcome documents on, for example, rural or regional development, but not really on any structural social redistribution within society. So again, it's the citizens of the lower and middle income groups that are overlooked in these big policy plans. And I do think this is one of the weak spots. The government does, to some extent, take citizens' trust and willingness to struggle for the country, for the party, for granted. And we do have seen at the end of 2022 with the zero COVID protest that this is a miscalculation that the Chinese government has made before, and which is why I think it's really important to watch any movement in the social policy field. And, you know, picking up on the point of protests, and I guess that maybe brings us over to the security question. Yes, the Chinese government does have a very high risk awareness. The catchphrase of cadres needing to get to an extreme scenario mindset to prepare for all black swans and gray rhinos and you know, longer term kind of challenges to party power are quite visible in a series of new policies and kind of the ongoing ideological campaigns. Maybe this is something we can pick up more in the discussion, but when it comes to the balance of security versus development liberalization, and that's the last point I want to add, I think we have to be really cautious to see even the reform steps that have been made in the past few months as something akin to liberalization or a return to liberalization, which is just fundamentally anathema to Xi Jinping's political vision and how he thinks the country should function. And what we do see going hand in hand with all these, you know, nice signals are efforts to expand party control in the private sector and in society more broadly, bringing party cells back in, having the new societal work department, you know, working with industry associations, actually going deeper into the private sector. And this is where we stand at the beginning of 2024.
Thank you, Katja. You mentioned the extreme scenario mindset that Xi Jinping has been calling for a lot. Ling Wei, let me turn back to you and ask you whether your feeling from conversations that you have in China, obviously, with officials as much as they're willing to talk, is do they feel that they are already in an extreme scenario? Or is this something that they're planning for and they're expecting things to become much more extreme, and what we're experiencing now is still within expected struggle mode and they're preparing for much worse? Where do you think they feel that they stand at the moment?
Sure. How do we define extreme scenarios, right? I mean, in terms of the economy, some contacts we have talked to, you know, they said that it's a miracle China hasn't had a financial crisis yet, right? Given the kind of debt stress both among local governments and in the private real estate sector. So I think, you know, the government definitely is prioritizing risk control in you know, in the sense that trying to prevent a full-blown financial crisis is one of their, you know, top agenda item for 2024. And you know, we just saw Xi Jinping's speech from yesterday, right? He really highlighted the need to strengthen the financial system in China. What really stood out for me was the remarks he talked about. We want to make sure that our financial system will be fundamentally different from the Western model. So again, that's further evidence that whenever China says that something with Chinese characteristics, that probably would mean anti-market. It's not some kind of reform signals we're looking for. For foreign investor, foreign Wall Street banks are hoping that greater liberalization in China's financial sector. Okay, you can just forget about that. The focus is going to be even greater state control over the financial sector to make sure risks don't spread too widely and too quickly. But we have seen the track record of state control, in terms of managing economy, not that great in the past few years. And in the broader term, the extreme scenario probably would mean, in the event of war. So who would China go into war with? That's a huge question, right? And I do think one question that keeps Xi Jinping at night these days is this competition with the United States, right? So that really helps explain why he put security ahead of everything else, ahead of economic development as the top level policy agenda for the entire party system. So we're going to see the government continuing to basically try to build up an economic system, a social system that is resilient against geopolitical challenges. We're going to see continued effort to try to beef up China's self-reliance in terms of high tech. The government trying to direct more resources into manufacturing, especially high-tech manufacturing, because Kaja made a good point about Xi Jinping's threshold for economic pain. Right now, yes, it's bad, but it's still tolerable, right? For a lot of people in China, they're spending less, they're flying business as opposed to first class, they're flying economy as opposed to business. They're not buying as many Dior dresses or Gucci bags. That's okay, but let's see, how much more stress that would build up. Obviously, one thing we have seen is that greater surveillance by the government in Chinese society. So that's the response to the economic stress so far, doubling down on state control, doubling down on greater surveillance. Really not, unfortunately, not seeing any sign of a meaningful course correction when it comes to political and economic agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. John, I'll throw a question at you that came up in the chat. It's, of course, an obvious one at the moment with the new anti-corruption campaign, the disappearance of the defense and the foreign ministers last year. What does this tell us about the system at the moment? Two such prominent figures and a lot of less prominent figures disappearing just a month after Xi Jinping instated them at the 20th Party Congress and the National People's Congress. How do people internally think about how successful he is in setting up his system if this is what happens just after he's assembled his new team?
Look, Bernard, it's certainly fascinating, and it looks a little bit messy from the outside. But I keep coming back to the people, Xi Jinping's role models, the textbooks that he and his parents' generation were reading. They're modeling themselves on Mao. They're modeling themselves on Stalin. The most read book when Xi Jinping was born in his father's generation was the Stalin's short course on the history of the Bolsheviks. And one of his key lines is, "You purge the party to make it strong." purging the party in this system when you have a strong man dictator, and China hasn't really had it for decades until now. Purging is a sign of strength, and although we're always aware of what we can't see, it's a black box system. One day we'll be surprised, one day we'll be very wrong. But at the moment, I can't see any signs of political weakness, even in these events of the last 6 and 9 months. That said, they're extraordinary. He's purged Qin Gang, his own handpicked foreign minister. As soon as he got the job, did the same for Li Shangfu, the defense minister. Even, I think much more significant in his case. He was Defense Minister Li was a princeling. He was in charge of equipment capability. He was given the Russia sort of strategic military envoy role, personally dealing with Putin. Incredibly powerful, important person. And then since then, I think the purges since then in the military have been even more significant. Decapitating the entire rocket force. This is China's most important services arm, with the ballistic missiles and the world's fastest growing nuclear arsenal it's all been decapitated over the last 6 and 9 months, and now this purge is spreading further through the Central Military Commission. So this is not a small deal, to the point where it actually affects China's war calculus. It would, this does not seem to be the moment where you'd want to risk uncontrolled escalation with the United States over Taiwan. But he's willing to take that cost to his perceptions, the cost to his actual power projection capabilities in the short term, in order to make his party stronger, in order to create more loyalty, more political and policy alignment, to put in place the generals that he wants in place for when it really counts. And the same is applied across the economic landscape. Just last week, the CCDI held its plenum meeting, and Xi Jinping's just highlighted a whole new set of sectors to roll through. One of them I'll highlight now because of the subject of this panel, pharmaceuticals. So he's committed to rectifying the pharmaceutical sector after giving the sector a hugely hard time last year already. The hospital system at the local government level, at the county level in China is already broken. And this shows that we're probably going to see even more paralysis in pharmaceuticals procurement in the hospital system. These are really stressful times, I think, for a lot of Chinese people. There's a lot of stress on the system, but I don't, for one, see it as a sign of political weakness for Xi Jinping. To the contrary.
Thank you. Katja, another audience question here for you. There's arguments that with all the internal challenges and issues that China has, it will be much calmer on the outside, much more peaceful, much less willing to engage in conflict. There's the counter argument that a system that's challenged at home will be more unpredictable outwardly and more hostile to the outside world. Which side of the argument are you on? What do you expect that we'll see from China as an external player, an issue that we'll debate more in the next panel then?
Well, I don't want to step too much into the topic for the next panel, but I think this is an area where you see this really strong connection between domestic and international behavior of Chinese government, as it is rooted in the party's ideology and really direction that Xi Jinping is giving. Because, I mean, we talked about the priority that national security has gained in Xi Jinping's policy agenda. And if you look at the long list of different areas of national security and how they need to be defended by all means, I think this explains quite a bit of what we've seen in terms of how the government has treated its economy, its citizens, as, for example, economic security, technological security, political and societal security are all top priority areas. So that means, making sure that what the party wants the country to be is what can be seen. And for example, when it comes to domestic policies, we see that in the rejection of criticism of the current economic situation, economists have been told to tone it down, to tone down criticism, to spread positive energy, right? So criticizing the cause, the situation, even if it is based on facts, is seen as a threat to the leadership, to Xi Jinping, and in a sense, a matter of national security. And now, take that mindset and look how China has been behaving internationally. Yes, there's, the held out hand for investment, and especially to new partners in the global south and across the world. But once, a counterpart starts criticizing the Chinese government, starts enforcing and defending their interests vis-a-vis China, relations quickly turn sour, and you trigger quite an aggressive reflex that, again, I think can be explained through this priority of national security, which does mean putting China's interests first.
Thanks. I'll stay with you, Katja, for a second, because again, it's something I know that you and your team are working on. We've talked a lot about politics. Now let's think a little bit about people who are not in politics, broader social trends. One of the trends that we've seen over the last 2 years are these soft social rebellions of laying low, those last generation arguments. What can you gather about social trends that are reactions to the trajectory that China has currently taken, and what are the most interesting, important social trends that you are looking at over the coming year?
I mean, I think, our research work in the team and in collaboration projects where we've looked at social debates, Chinese social media, op-eds and articles by academics is really an important exercise for anyone who wants to understand what's happening in the country, especially from abroad. And work on that has shown how crucial it is to look beyond the party. For example, at the beginning of last year, when everyone, or not everyone, but quite a few commentators were expecting a quick return to new economic heights after the end of zero COVID, the story turned out quite different. But for those that really followed debates in Chinese social media, this did not come as a surprise. You could see concerns and worries and disillusionments building up over a long time. And this is something where we see that, concerns over livelihoods, over government overreach, over dim prospects, has not, fully gone away. I think the fact that lying flat is now known around the world as a term speaks to the fact that, that this has become an important concept that doesn't only resonate in China, but around the world. Internet slang, just generally terminology, can help us understand where the country is going and where the mood is at. And, we were talking before about what keeps Xi Jinping up at night. And I do think this is one of these topics. What will China's next generation or next generations do? Because something that, the white paper protest at the end of 2022 really drove home is that the younger generations are not the apolitical, consumption-focused, nationalist, individuals that, follow the party wherever it leads, but quite the opposite, that once their future prospects are impinged upon, where they feel under pressure, that they are willing to actually take action, that they do have a different vision for themselves when it comes to, their role in society, what they deserve from an employer, what they deserve in society. And that's actually one of the good things that China's strong economic development brought, that the younger generation is taking certain rights, certain amenities and a certain livelihood standard for granted, and wants to keep that up. And I do think we already see the government reacting to that. Just think about the new patriotic education law that was enacted at the end of last year. This is really one of the measures, of the series of measures that has been implemented to future-proof China's next generations, to make them, recommit to the party, so to say.
Thank you. Another question from the chat here for you, Ling, on demographic trends, the end of the one-child policy, the two-child policy that we have now. Do you see that having an effect already? And more broadly, what are the family views and developments that you see developing in China at the moment?
That's a great question, and my colleagues recently did a really good story, a page one Wall Street Journal story, just about how Chinese women have been responding to the government's so-called pressure on them to have more kids. As Kasia mentioned, the catchphrase in Chinese society these days is lying flat. This is a very kind of a passive kind of resistance, right, to government pressure, because people feel increasingly uncertain about their future. A lot of our women friends in China we talk to, they have chosen not to date, not to get married, not to have children, because of all the reasons we just talked about earlier. So not so successful so far. And in terms of government effort. And again, if there are people not seeing the economic prospects, their job prospects, recovering, the incentives to have bigger families are just not there. I would just add one small point to what Kasia pointed out earlier. This in terms of social trend, I would really be on the lookout for any signs of those kind of passive resistance becoming more active. Obviously with surveillance, with the government doubling down on surveillance in society, probably very difficult for people to pull off a more larger scale protests and all that. But let's see how much stress in the system is building up. And even the Chinese people who have very high tolerance for pain, there are limits for them.
Thank you. And that's the last question for John. There are the limits of pain and the question of passive or active resistance. What do you see developing there in the coming month?
Look, I think Ling Wei is right that there's a lot of capacity for pain, but also, as we've heard already, there's the world's most sophisticated, extensive, and I think actually underestimated surveillance control state system. So I think it's unlikely that we can foreshadow social cleavages and unrest that this system hasn't already thought about and found ways to co-op and shape into acquiescence. I think that the interesting stories are going to be. I think the word struggle is important where we started, Bernard, and I think the world's going to see what the phrase "united front" means in action. My expectation is this might not be the year for a kinetic war, but everything that Xi Jinping has been saying over his whole life, but particularly in the last few weeks through these foreign affairs conferences and conclaves, it's all about the united front system. I think the response to the election of William Lai in Taiwan is really interesting. It hasn't been military fireworks, but we're just seeing the first forays into a new level of united front work, pressure on governments not to even congratulate the new president. We're limited by our imagination in the vectors and intensity of pressure and incentives that China is going to apply to outside states and actors and corporate actors in dealing with Taiwan and dealing with China. So that's my to-watch scenario for 2024.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this first session of Seeking Expert Wisdom for the Outlook for 2024. Thank you very, very much, Ling Wei, John Garnaut, and Katja Drienhausen. And we will now turn to our crowd wisdom part of today's conference and to the MERICS China Forecast survey that we have now been doing for 5 years in a row. This year, one of the lead authors and experts at MERICS behind this survey has been my colleague Klaus Sung, an analyst in our foreign relations team. We sent out the survey to China experts late last year. 650 people have replied to the 25 questions that we put out to you. And I'm now handing the screen to Klaus Sung, who is going to run us through the most interesting results from this survey. Klaus. Klaus, we cannot hear you at the moment. And at least on my screen, I cannot.
Thanks, Bernhard.
Now I hear you well.
Thank you. Thanks, Bernhard. So the broad picture that emerged from this year's MERICS China Forecast survey is that experts expect a very difficult year for China, both internally and externally. So in 2024, crucial election in Taiwan just happened a few days ago, and in the coming months in European Union and in the United States in November will shape global geopolitics. We see tension between US and China persist. For Europeans, the Ukrainian war and China's support for Russia will continue to influence views on China, but other issues are getting even more attention. Domestic challenges are set to intensify due to deteriorating economic conditions in China. And we see the economic downturn will limit Beijing's option for significant actions. So in the following slides, let me show you some key findings from our survey in detail. So on the economic side, we see China's economy is facing a downturn of growth. More than 50% of participants in our survey believe that weakened consumption and the debt crisis in both real estate and government sector pose significant risk to China's growth. Also, we found geopolitical competition also poses risk to China's economic outlook. In domestic politics, we see a trend. The general expectation is that the continuation towards securitization of everything and the prioritizing ideology over pragmatism. From our survey, 2/3, 67% of our survey respondents expect Beijing will prioritize securitizations of everything with the trade-off of growth and infliction of social cost. The respondent also shows that the likelihood of a shift toward pragmatism is low, with only 22% of respondents expect such a change. So let's move on foreign policy of China. On China's foreign policy, we asked about China's position in Russia's war against Ukraine. So in our survey, 48% of the respondents expect ongoing support from China to Russia at the current level to remain a status quo. 37% even anticipate an expansion of support from China in the economic and political domain to Russia. However, very notably, and then very noteworthily, you see only 10% of our respondents expect that China will go further to provide lethal military equipment to Russia. On bilateral relations, we construct a scale from 1, deteriorated considerably, to 5, improved considerably, and set the scale 3 as unchanged on bilateral relations. So from the graph, we can see on the selected countries outside of Europe, we observe a different expectation for Western and non-Western countries. China's relation with Western countries and their allies, such as US, Israel, Ukraine, and Japan, are expected to slightly deteriorate or remain close to unchanged. While bilateral relations with non-Western country, we see a general expectation to improve. We can see from the upper right-hand side, Iran, Brazil, and South Africa are all expected to improve with a score above 4. Russia is at 3.5, while in this category, we see India is an exception. So moving on to the EU-China relation, we see that under the de-risking policy objective, respondents pinpoint the following top challenges. We see EU's China policy across parliamentary and commission mandates, economic coercion from China, and tech transfer. Notably, human rights concerns are least cited, and also very noteworthily, comparing in 2023 and 2024. In these two surveys, we see China's role in Ukraine, once a major concern last year, has waned. That suggests a potential shift in the European mindset. On China-EU relation for cooperation, we see a concrete and constructive agenda remain uncertain. But we see climate change policy and business opportunity stand out as the most promising area for progress in EU-China cooperation. We also see limited potential, particularly in global governance and the reform of international order. The 2023 and 2024 results from the survey are similar, but there's a noticeable decrease in the perceived possibility of cooperation in the domains in 2024 compared to 2023. So let's move on to Europe priorities in terms of de-risking. We see under the de-risking agenda, our survey shows the participants have a mixed view over EU's priority. Most respondents, about 33%, believe that EU need to build a more efficient political mechanism, such as establishing member states' consensus. 28% think there is a need for new policy to address dependency on China, while about 24% believe in strengthening the existing policy tool. So on following the de-risking agenda, here we see almost 70% of all respondents think that EU should significantly increase the measure to create alternative supply chain for strategic goods, which the EU is currently heavily dependent on China. So you can see from the right-hand side on the bottom, that is the preference of our respondent. The second most supported measure is negotiating trade agreement with partners, such as India, while also conducting anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese export and outbound investment screen is less supported, as we see. Moving on to EU's external partnership and engagement. We see from our result here, over half of respondents think the EU should diversify its partnership globally, especially in Asia-Pacific region or in Africa. Only 16% believe that EU should align more with the US, while even less is about 9% think that EU should rebuild its trust with China. We also see 20% of our respondents believe that EU should leverage its position between the two giant powers. We also see this result could link to the attitude in the future of transatlantic cooperation on China. So, on transatlantic cooperation on China, our respondents are divided. The division might be partially influenced by the uncertainty surrounding the election in the US in November. Over 40% of our respondents expect no clear change, while almost equal percentage, around 22% each, anticipate either some decrease or some increase in cooperation. This uncertainty over the future course of the US election must be expected to become a characteristic challenge of the year 2024. But this reminds us that Europeans must not wait for Washington to pursue their own interest and strategy toward China. We are here at the end of the forecast result presentation. Thank you all. Now back to Bernhard.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I think this forecast survey again gives us a very good baseline of expectations for this year. It also points to quite a number of areas where there is an enormous uncertainty, and these are, of course, areas that we will need to look at intensely. You can find the whole survey results online, and they have massive implications for how we are going to experience China as a global actor. And that is the topic of our second panel now, for which I'm very pleased to hand over the screen to Nicole Bastian, who's the foreign editor of Handelsblatt, who is going to run us through this second part of the discussion. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bernhard Bartsch. And welcome to our second panel on China's global ambitions. With elections in the US and Europe, is Beijing hoping for a crisis of the West? We have already received some very interesting questions for you. Don't hesitate to ask more of them. We will try to include as many of them as possible. Let me introduce our panel. And I'll start with Tara Varma. She's a visiting fellow at Brookings, an expert on security in the Indo-Pacific and on European foreign policies. We have with us Richard McGregor, a journalist, author, and a senior fellow for East Asia at the Australian Lowy Institute. He's an expert on China's political system and on China's foreign relations. We have with us Abigail Vassilier. She's head of the foreign relations team at MERICS, and previously she has been the deputy head for China at the European External Action Service. And last but definitely not least, we have with us Eva Vallagar. She's the head of the Far East unit of the Directorate General for Trade in Brussels and the head of the trade sections at the delegation of the EU to China. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us. Let's start perhaps with a look to the US. We have seen with the Iowa caucus that a candidacy of Donald Trump is getting more and more probable. Richard, what are the hopes and what are the fears of the leadership in Beijing towards the American presidential election?
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks to MERICS for having me on the panel. Yes, I was trying to think today something interesting to say about Trump. What if Trump wins? That seems to be the main issue of that people are focused on. And I recalled the phrase that Wen Jiabao, famous phrase that Wen Jiabao had about the Chinese economy about 15 years ago, and that was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, unsustainable. Trump is much like that. I would add one more, just as important: unpredictable. Now, I think in the case of Trump and China, I think there's an upside and a downside. Let me unpack that. And in doing so, we have to understand that a lot of the way that China sees Trump, these are stories they tell themselves. That's not always the same as reality. And I think we also have to be honest about, no matter what we think about Trump's legacy. So let's look at, I think, the upside for China and Trump. There's a core of Chinese leadership who view the Americans as, in irretrievable decline. Trump is a symptom of that decline, of democratic dysfunction. China is quite happy to see the world's most powerful democracy set a bad example for the world. We've got a greater debate globally these days about, we haven't got a bipolar world, but there is, China building an alternative world order, alternative institutions, so-called global South and all that. So Trump and American dysfunction is great internal, external propaganda for the Chinese in that respect. But on the downside for China, now look, you can view Trump in many ways. I'm no Trump fan, but the Chinese thought they had Trump under control with a bit of flattery, a bit of bribery, a few import deals, that sort of thing. But he is unpredictable. His chief of staff doesn't know what he's going to do, so the Chinese don't know what he's going to do, and they certainly didn't. And I think his unpredictability actually built a deal of leverage that others had failed to create with China. He changed policy. The Biden administration has not changed it back. And in fact, they built on it professionally. So I think that's important. One reason Trump was able to do that, of course, he had many good staff in the National Security Council. And it's an open question as to whether he's going to have good staff this time around and who will work for him. Just on the downside, once again, on foreign policy, I think one of the themes of the Biden administration has been that they don't try to shape what's happening inside China. They try to shape the world around China. And I think they've had quite a deal of success in recent years. Once again, not just starting with Biden, but you look, for example, at Japan, South Korea, US, the trilateral. That is a new thing. Trump, the arrival of Trump, the disdain for allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, particularly South Korea, I would say, that could be unwound. That's very important. The Quad, does he care about the Quad? I don't think so very much. Australia and AUKUS, for example, Trump could be much less enthusiastic about the export of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. That could effectively puncture a big hole in AUKUS as well. I'm not going to talk about Europe. I think that you have many other people on this panel who know much more than me. So I just think the essence of Trump is unpredictability. He keeps people off balance. His legacy on China in many respects had a lot of positive things going for it. But just like his domestic position, he's the enemy of democracy. And I think China kind of likes that.
Thank you, Richard. Tara, perhaps you can further give us your vision of what the impact after the US election would be for China in a Trump administration or in a Biden administration.
Sure, thank you so much, and thanks to MERICS for the invitation. I would say if it were Trump, I see three options, and these three options are not mutually exclusive, but they give different strands of what Trump has done in his first term and things that he could continue if he were to be elected. The first one, I would say, is kind of the Peter Navarro strand, so a very trade and economic focused agenda. Peter Navarro said even recently that he thought the way to deal with the China challenge would be for the US to fully decouple with China. So what we saw in the first administration were tariffs that were slapped, a trade war that was started. So it would be something along the likes of, again, a pretty massive trade war with China in a way to get rid of the China challenge. The second option is looking more at Asia first people. So people who are more in the traditional security field, who are saying that the US is devoting too much energy and money to other terrains, such as the war in Ukraine right now, of course, the Middle East as well, and that actually China being the main challenge for the US, there should be the vast majority of resources devoted to the China challenge. So this trend is more focused on military confrontation, on military imbalance in the Indo-Pacific, and trying to get the US to refocus in China. And the third option is Trump himself. I think Richard was pointing to the unpredictability of Trump. That is absolutely true. What is also true is that there are key tenets of his foreign policy that we've seen throughout the first administration. One is admiration for autocrats and dictators, and I think that would still be true. And the second is really an aversion and a dislike for multilateral organizations, which we would see as well, and which would have, I think, detrimental consequences for Europeans. And what we would see with Trump, I think, is definitely, I guess, an unpredictability in his relationship to China, but I think the sense that he does want, I think he would want Beijing's help in trying to get the North Korea issue resolved. He tried to do this in his first term. It's an issue that he cares deeply about. He's really scared of nuclear war. He doesn't like war, generally speaking. He doesn't want to send US soldiers abroad. And so I think he would, it would not be impossible for me to see him trying to get a deal with Xi Jinping in order to get the North Korea agenda resolved. So I think that you get a sense here of a variety of options that could take place.
Thanks a lot, Tara.
Biden were to be re-elected.
Sorry, no, please go on, sorry.
Very quickly, I think if Biden were to be re-elected, we would see a continuation of what has been happening. So really more toughness on export controls and trying to build to continue building, rebuilding this network of alliances in the Indo-Pacific through military, but also trade and security alliances, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for instance, elevating, partnerships like the one with Vietnam to strategic partnerships, developing even more relationships with India, developing AUKUS even more. So basically a continuation of what we've seen in the past 4 years.
I see. Thank you, Tara. So let's move on to the European China policy in light of possible tensions between the US and Europe if we would get a Trump administration. Abigail, what would be the main factors you see for European China policy this and next year?
I think the survey is telling us a lot about what are going to be the drivers and shapers of European-China relations next year. And I think one important point is how much the election can and will influence the China agenda. And when we ask experts, some of them foresee that in the next 3 years, there could be a new European policy on China. If this was to happen, this would be basically a shift. There are underlying factors that have been there and have shaped European approach to China. The first is how much China supports Russia in the war of aggression against Ukraine. There will be no return in the European approach to China compared to before the war. This is a shift in the European approach, and this is here to continue. The question is just how Europe is going to continue reacting to that trend. And if China were to cross a red line, how would Europe react? I think that's a key point. Another point is what John mentioned at the end, which is the question of Taiwan. If there was an escalation of tension, the European Union and member states would have to react. What kind of reaction could we expect? And Ambassador Toledo said it, there could be a scope for increased tension in the next 3 months. And the last factor is the one that we are discussing, which is the US election. And it's clear that the Chinese have adjusted their relation with Europe in regard to the US. And Europe has learned to navigate that and is extremely aware of the role it plays in the US-China dynamics. And part of the efforts of the European Union has been to be able to stabilize that through dialogue with the US. And to a certain extent, the EU-US dialogue on China was launched under the Trump administration and continued with the Biden administration. But just to say, there is an awareness by the European Union that we are playing a role in that dynamics, and we are at the receiving end of this. And that's why I think the pursuing a China policy that much our interest is a key part, which is let's not wait for an election in another country, but let's look at what does Europe want from China and where do we where are we ready to put our weights and our instruments in place to get what we want out of China? I think that's one important element. There is a second important element for next year, which is we are entering a phase of re-engagement. This is what China wants, to re-engage Europe. And in like 17 days, we have already seen 4 leaders meeting, which I think is unprecedented and tells you a lot how China is going to give this feel-good time to Europeans without a serious offer, because they can't. With the US election, China will not have a serious offer for Europe. So the question is going to be for us, what do we want this engagement to look like? And in a context where we are going to have European leaders meeting the Chinese leadership, how much coordination in terms of messages there would be? And this is not only between Europe, but also with partners. And in that sense, this year, Italy is chairing the G7. There is a lot of expectation as regards Italy playing this coordination role at G7 level with other partners. And in that front, we should go beyond the US and the transatlantic dimension.
Just a quick follow-up question from the audience. Do you see any indicators that the EU is trying to form closer relations with Taiwan and change the status of ambiguity which we have at the moment?
Well, I don't see any ambiguity, I have to say. I think the Europeans have been pretty consistent in their approach. They have tried to develop relations with Taiwan in all sectors that do not imply diplomatic recognition. And this is part of the EU's One China policy. So the European Union and its member states have all gone through the same direction, which is in a way to develop the partnership that we have with Taiwan, making it with substance and consistency, while basically working in the framework of EU's One China policy. So I do not see any ambiguity, and I just see the same trajectory.
Okay, thank you. Eva, let's look at the economic relationship between the EU and China. The survey we saw, the MERICS survey we saw would predict a gradual deterioration in the relationship. Is that also your view, or what do you expect?
Hello. Well, thank you first to MERICS for inviting me to this panel. As everybody said, I want to clarify that I'm no longer head of trade section in Beijing. I left that job in June, and my colleague Mario Hanonen has it very, very much under control. I also wanted to thank Abigail for first of making clear that the EU has its own policy on China and external policy in general. So I think that's the basis. Your survey is very, very interesting, and there are many aspects that I find really worth note-taking. And if you allow me later, I'd like to make one point. But to answer your question, I wouldn't say I see a deterioration. What I see essentially is a continuation and I think that is also to a large degree inherent in, you see it in the survey. There's a continuation of the imbalances in trade and on investment. In investment, as Katja has said, the reforms are not about opening up, are more about control. So I do see a continuation of the existing asymmetry in market access in terms of investment. I also see a continuation of policies that have been serving well, protecting their domestic market to promote this self-sufficiency and build these champions. I do not see a departure from that, although I could see some adjustments in light of concerns about the economy and the first FDI outflows that China was experiencing last year. And I do see an ongoing drive towards security that will continue to impact the business climate. On trade, again, we've all seen the continuation of the drag of the real estate, of the lower consumption. Limits to infrastructure means a continuation of the supply side stimulus to the manufacturing sector, which, if not absorbed domestically, will continue to result in overcapacities to a large degree exported to the most open economies and creating concerns in our industries. So yes, I do see that if China doesn't rein in its imbalances, and I think in the survey, nobody was particularly optimistic on that front, those imbalances will continue to create problems in the open economies of the world, particularly the EU, and will continue to raise tensions. That I do see in the year ahead, but I also want to see some hopes for more positive aspects of the relationship. I do not know whether you want me to elaborate now or later.
Oh, please do, please do.
So I would like to see hope that we can continue to maintain engagement. Abi referred to the flurry of high-level engagement that we've seen last year, which was unprecedented. And I think it is very positive. Again, I think it is very important that we have face-to-face that conversation with the top Chinese leadership, that they hear how things are perceived in Europe and how distortions in the Chinese economy are impacting the European economy, creating imperatives for political action. I would also like to see that we can continue to work constructively with China and the WTO, ideally with more ambition, with more drive, addressing in general global challenges also like debt restructuring and climate, of course. I would like to see China play a more constructive, responsible role as a permanent member of the UN Security Council in respect of the war to Russia. I got very concerned by the replies of your respondents, which I hope they truly do not predict reality. And last, I also don't want to lose hope that we can establish some sort of constructive engagement also in the field of trade, investment, economics. As I said, China is also concerned by the situation of its economy. It is experiencing negative FDI outflows in the last quarter. There should be margin to engage, if not in fundamentally strategic market opening policies, but at least in improving business climate and addressing some of the concerns that we've been voicing today.
Before turning to China's, Ukraine and Russia's politics, I would like to give one of the questions from the audience to you, Eva. How likely is the EU to complete its economic security strategy before the elections?
To complete is a very big word, and economic security is a very broad domain. We will certainly continue to work towards our economic security. This is the imperative of any responsible government, stakeholder, policymaker. So that path will continue, and we will continue to deepen. You know that there's a package of economic security measures that builds again on the communication from last June that is coming out very, very soon, and we will continue to, and that will be a first package of measures that then will need to be put in place. I do not see that we have any option to derail from this line. Of course, I mean, I cannot predict what the next college will say, but I think ensuring the security of our economy, reducing vulnerabilities, eliminating risks is the only option for any responsible stakeholder. In that context, I wanted to make a clarification from one of the slides in the survey on what is de-risking and what is not de-risking. The investigation on electric vehicles, like any trade defense measure, is not about de-risking. This is traditional level playing field trade defense. It's about dealing with unfair trade. This is not about risk. It's neither that. The more hardcore risks that we deal with export investment, investment screening, with dual-use export controls, etc., or with sanctions, nor with the more supply chain resilience, vulnerability, eliminating dependencies that are excessive and are concerning, and eliminating vulnerability measures. It's all dealing with weaponization. It's not about that. It's traditional trade defense. It should not be mixed with the risking. And the EU is very much attached to ensure that it's not because of, in the name of economic security, that is a big concern, that we throw all the multilateral rules out of the window. We're very much attached to the existing framework, to the existing rules, and we don't want to endanger the WTO framework with too broad or careless interpretations of economic security. We're trying to do this with rigor and producing a robust framework. So yes, we will work on that direction for sure.
Thank you. We have several questions concerning China's Russia and Ukraine policy and the implications for the EU and China relationship. One question is, do you think China will be more active this year in meditating a peace solution between Russia and Ukraine? Richard, perhaps you want to give us your view on that.
I don't think so. I think China takes its cue on issue, generally speaking, from Russia. I'm not sure that it has a great deal of influence over the actual course of the war and the concrete actions of Mr. Putin. It doesn't appear that China is selling Russia arms, but it's supporting it in all manner of other ways, which in fact is an increasingly profitable trade for China. Maintaining ties with good ties, strong ties with Russia, I think, is also part of China's long game in the competition with the United States. Certainly, I think China's been very disturbed at different times about the war. More disturbed, I guess, about the fact that Russia could be losing the war. But I think they are a follower, not a leader on this issue. And I'm not sure who has any great influence over Mr. Putin other than Mr. Putin himself.
Very clear answer. Thank you, Richard. Tara or Abigail, do you also want to elaborate on that point?
Sure, if I may go, I'll be brief. I fully agree with what Richard has just said. I think another example of this totally imbalance in China's position, despite providing a so-called peace plan, is that it took Xi Jinping 18 months to speak to Volodymyr Zelensky, while in the same time frame he spoke to Putin, I think, over 10 times. And it was just before the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that they held a meeting, Putin and Xi Jinping, where they said that they had a limitless partnership. So I think it's China's approach to this is really not balanced. It's clearly in favor of Russia. It is supporting Russia, and it's also, I think, benefiting from the chaos and instability that it has brought to the European continent. I think there is also a sense here that if Europe is weakened, then there's an interest for China there too. So I think we should keep that in mind as well, and keep pushing as Europeans for China to be a more responsible stakeholder on the international stage. It's not because China has behaved this way until now that we should give up. I think we should still try and hold China accountable for its actions as well.
Thank you, Tara. Abigail, do you want to add?
I can say a few words about how Europe will have to react. As I said, when the war started, it was the clear realization that the convergence and the support that China would provide to Russia would pose a threat to a number of European member states. And when the joint statement that appeared on the 4th of February came, I really remember several member states saying there will be no return to before. If there is a limitless partnership between China and Russia, and China is ready to go all the way, then we cannot stand that. And in a way, this is the beginning of a shift, and this is pushing Europe to take stands on China that they have never done before. And I think on the Chinese leadership side, it's interesting to see that at the beginning of the war, they did not anticipate how much their support to Putin would weigh into their relationship with Europe. And I really think that at the beginning, they thought they could get away with it. And now it has, over the past years, just become an irritant that is so major, so structural, that the Chinese leadership is ready to be extremely careful and extremely calibrated in the support it brings to the Russian war efforts. And I think this is why we have seen the Chinese willing to look into the sanction question, willing to look into the companies that would provide support to the Russians, and be very calibrated into the support that they bring, because they know that there would be consequences, and certain consequences will be difficult to revert back. Having said that, if you compare the forecast this year and the forecast last year, you see that last year China's support to Russia was one of the top 3 challenges in Europe-China relations. And this year, it's, I think, among the top 5. So it's simply going down, but I think it's simply going down because it has become structural.
Thank you, Abigail. Eva, we have one question from the audience concerning Europe's position in the global competition situation. The question is, we have witnessed the weak response of the European Union in developing most modern technological fields like digital currency and electric cars. How can Europe, what consequences will this have on Europe in a new world order of competition? So can we still catch up would be my interpretation.
First, if you allow me a quick comment on something that on what Tara and Avi were elaborating in, because I find it extremely illuminating. It is absolutely true that the stance that China has taken on Russia has had a fundamental impact on EU-China relations. On the way China is perceived in the West, which is one of the messages that all of our leadership has been bringing directly to Beijing to make sure that the news really reach the right destinataire in the raw form. And I want to go back to Tara. We have not given up on China and on making it accountable, and on the hope that there is room for improvement. It is the #1 topic that our leadership always brings up in interactions with the Chinese leadership. So it's definitely fundamentally important, definitely having a massive impact in the breadth of our relationship, but not giving up. Now, I'm not sure I understood very well the question of the audience. I think you reinterpreted it, Nicole, in the only possible way. So is there space for Europe to still catch up? I hope there's still space for Europe to catch up. We are doing a lot, putting in place a lot of new initiatives to support strategic and technological development and research and development in Europe. So there is a lot of programs in place that I truly hope will bear fruit. But I wanted to clarify, in case my interpretation of the question is a little bit more negative, that this is not the reason why we put in place trade defense investigations. Europe has always been open and very much in favor of competition. Competition is in our DNA. We have it established in the treaty. I worked 90 years in the Director General for Competition, so I do believe fundamentally that competition results in the best products, in the most innovative products, lower prices, all to the benefit of consumers, and it is also the best allocation of state funds. I don't think anybody in Europe is scared of competition. We welcome it, but it needs to be fair. And that is where we have fundamental problems. I do not think that Europe is lagging behind in any technological sector because of lack of competition. And I do not think that protecting industries so that they catch up is what we're trying to do. We are not protectionistic. We are in favor of competition when it is fair, and we only protect against unfair trade practices. I hope that answers the audience.
I have another question for you, Eva. Abigail talked about the feel-good time we have now with Chinese re-engaging again without any serious offer, you said, Abigail. And there's one question from the audience. We had a very clear stance of the European Union at the EU-China summit and asking for changes. And the question from the audience is, how much time will Europe give China before we see any actions? And is China only buying time at the moment? What's your impression, Eva?
How much time before what? It's a bit of a complicated question, but and it also has to do with managing expectations. It is true that we have had a flurry of engagement last year, but at each and every point of time, our leaders have passed the message that engagement for the sake of engagement actually backfires. That it is imperative that we show that engagement leads to a tangible rebalancing of what is a very, very lopsided relationship. I think engagement, you can understand it in different ways. In the way it was portrayed, particularly in the last of the years, is also engagement for the sake of having that difficult relationships, difficult conversations that maybe individual member states or certainly individual companies do not dare to have with the Chinese leadership. So someone has to have that difficult conversation to manage the relationship in a responsible manner, to avoid misunderstandings and to avoid it unraveling. And that type of engagement was also a very significant part of the engagement last year and will continue to be present. Yes, we would like China to be more responsive, and we have a fair deal of frustration seeing that that our asks are not immediately acted upon, because we do believe in win-win, and that it would be fundamentally also in China's interest to have a more rebalanced relationship with the EU. We will keep on trying, but then it takes two to tango. It takes two to build trust, to take steps that help and rebalance the relationship, and we hope we won't be alone. But the ball is in China's hands, definitely. We have a huge deficit that is just the expression of fundamental imbalances that we have been complaining about. We have a series of concerns that we put on the table. We have some moderate asks that we put on the table as measures that would show trust, that would inject momentum, and would take the relationship in the right path. So the ball is in their hands to really take it up and act upon our requests, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you. Abigail, how united will Europe be, in your view, in its China policy? Because that, of course, would strengthen the position towards China.
Yes, unity gives us leverage, and unity is the basis of our action. I think that's the basic for the European Union in working on China, with China, and with partners on China as well. I think we start 2024 with the highest degree of European unity in EU-China history. And you see it actually in the forecast. If you compare the results between 2023 and 2024, in 2023, unity was actually the biggest challenge for Europe in its dealing with China. And if you look at the results this year, unity is one of the last challenge we have in our dealings with China. And I think it shows that really unity is at its best. The question is, how do we maintain that this year in a context where the war in Ukraine is going to continue, and as I said, there could be crossing red lines and reaction from the European Union on that front. And then when that moment comes, are we going to to be all together to take measures? First question. The second question that I see as a challenge on our unity is we have what Eva described as this fair deal of frustration and this moment in which China needs Europe, especially vis-à-vis the US. So it does mean that re-engagement may come with a Chinese offer, not to the Union, because we will have election, but to several member states, a selected number of member states. Can this divide Europe? And China has been quite good at playing member states against each other. So I think unity for member states is going to be key. And there is some work that needs to be done internally as regard this. Finally, I think if we have to take stock of what the Commission has done during this mandate, the Commission has worked tremendously well on the defensive instrument and to building together an economic security package that is balanced, and Eva explained it quite well. And the question is now, the Commission will have 6 months to show that these defensive instruments can be used, can last, can go over to the next mandate in a context where the Chinese may come after us, not with tit for tat in the way we have seen them going after the French on the question of brandy, but I think it may be on a bigger scale. And at that moment, we need to ensure that there is unity between ourselves. So this I see as the main three challenges, but honestly speaking, in the history of EU-China relations, we are entering 2024 on a very solid footstep.
That's a positive note there. Let's broaden for the last minutes of our discussion again the perspective to China's foreign policy and its aim to change the global world order. Richard and Tara, what impact do you see also in the relation between China and the global South, which is one of the big topics China's always mentioning?
Yes, leaving aside how, you know, the phrase the global South is horribly inexact and inaccurate, yes, I mean, there are many drivers of this. We saw with the Israel-Hamas clash, China had been trying to get close to Israel for years. They dumped them very quickly because they thought Israel was on the wrong side of that alternative world order. I think just very briefly, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, we're now at kind of BRI 3.0. Chinese lending has gone down dramatically. China's now a creditor as much as a lender. But I think China has replaced the BRI in many respects with big ideas to appeal to the so-called Global South, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. In some respects, these are more powerful than the BRI because there are ideas which says to, you know, the Global South, we will put you at the center of the new world order, the Americans won't. And I think we underestimate the power of that narrative at our peril.
I think when China addresses the global South, it's not as a leader of the global South anymore. It is really actually as a leader in the global North, or at least a leader which is on the fence between the global North and the global South. And it does come with an alternative worldview. You know, it criticizes the West, the US and Europe for having double standards, not having the same kind of standards when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the situation in Israel, Palestine. It keeps pointing to how weak basically the West is and how the West is incapable of bringing new and concrete ideas to the global South. And I they do feel that they find some leverage in it, and it's a way to qualify them. And so I think we should be mindful that actually a number of countries in the global South do like it and consider themselves as being part of this group. But I think what China is doing when it comes to its foreign policy is not just talking to the global South. And we saw it with Prime Minister Li Qiang's address in Davos yesterday, which really reminded me of Xi Jinping's address to Davos in 2017, presenting China as a defender of the global order, of globalization, of multilateralism. In 2017, the situation, of course, was pretty different. I think the West was still very stunned by Donald Trump's election a few months before, and we were still trying to understand what America's positioning in the international order would be. This time around, it's really I guess surprising and not surprising that China wants to present also, again, this face of itself, the defender of globalization and of the global order, in the face of a more polarized US, definitely, and of a very complicated presidential campaign that seems to be announced. So I think we should be mindful that China will probably push for a stronger voice on the international stage that might not always align with our own interests.
But what steps could the US and Europe take? I mean, do we have to give in and reform, for example, the seats in the International Monetary Fund, in the UN Security Council, in order to be credible and credible voices to the global South, if we define it?
I think we need to be coherent and consistent with ourselves, and there is a bit of a difference, I should say, here between the US and Europe. I think the US talks about a liberal international order, and so it's a very normative order. For once, I think Europe is a bit less normative and talks more of a multilateral order, a sense that we're in an international order where it's one country, one voice. And a number of international institutions that were inherited from the end of World War II need to be more representative of the global order of a different power balance today. And so a reform of the UN Security Council would be absolutely crucial, a reform of the international financial institutions too. To be fair, even the US said that the Washington consensus has ended, but we are yet to find the new post-Washington consensus that will define the new rules of this order, because I think what we believe in all is a rules-based international order.
Thank you very, very much, the four of you, for all your insights. Thank you, Tara Varma, Richard McGregor, Abigail Vassilier, and Eva Valaga. And I'm giving the mic back to you, Mikko Huotari, for the last words of this event.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. It's been an absolute pleasure. This is a wrap now. This was the MERICS 2024 China Forecast event. 2 intense hours. We have many more hours and months and weeks ahead to digest what's actually happening. I'm not going to try to summarize this excellent set of inputs. This is certainly only a snapshot of the things that we anticipate, of the many things that we don't know. We've learned about China's domestic trajectory, about managing expectations globally. If I want to summarize maybe in one sentence, status quo and stability would be, in a way, already a best case scenario for some of the developments that we've discussed today. Now we hope for more. We also hope for more engagement, and that indeed, as Eva said, needs to lead some concrete results. But I want to end here and thank all panelists for their time today, and also thank the audience for the engagement. It's absolutely critical that we stay in touch on these issues. Getting China right has never been more important than today. Getting China wrong is absolutely in the realm of the possible. So we are happy to provide a platform for the best possible China conversations that we can have, and look forward to being in touch with you throughout this year. And have a good time. Thank you for joining us today. See you very soon. Thank you.